Welcome to Recapped. The movie opens on an episode of the popular game show To Tell the Truth set in 1977, where three contestants appear claiming to the panelists to be the legendary Frank William Abagnale, who impersonated an airline pilot, a lawyer, and a doctor, as well as scam people on 3 continents for millions of dollars. All before reaching the age of 19. Frank gets asked who caught him, and he reveals the name of Carl Hanratty. The film then shifts to 1969, with FBI agent Carl Hanratty arriving at a French prison to extradite a flu-stricken Frank Abagnale Jr., who attempts to escape from the prison but is too sick to even make it outside. Frank surrenders and asks Carl to take him home. The film then flashes back to 6 years earlier. 16-year-old Frank Abagnale Jr. lives in New Rochelle, New York with his father Frank Abagnale, and French mother Paula. Frank idolizes his father and is so proud of seeing him being inducted into the New Rochelle Rotary Club Wall of Honor as a lifetime member. One morning, Frank's father rouses him out of bed and takes him to a store where Frank watches as his father cons a woman into lending him a black suit for Frank Jr. Frank then drives his father to the Chase Manhattan Bank dressed with the suit and pretending to be his chauffeur, in a ruse to impress the bank people and secure a loan. When the loan is denied, due to a series of IRS tax frauds by Frank Sr., the family is forced to move from their grand home to a small apartment, which causes tension between Frank's parents. Frank is then enrolled in a public school where he shows up for his first day in his former school's uniform. When he hears some guys in his class making fun of his uniform as he enters the class, Frank walks to front of the class and pretends to be the new class substitute teacher. The ruse goes on for a week's time before Frank is found out, and his parents are called in to discuss the matter. While his mother is upset by this, Frank's father is rather impressed by how far his son was able to go with the con. One day, coming back from school, Frank catches his mother having an adulterous affair with his father's friend. Soon afterwards, Frank comes home to find out that his parents are getting a divorce. When asked with which of his parents he wishes to stay with, Frank runs away from home, using his checkbook to con his way into transportation and shelter. When Frank quickly runs out of money, he tries to create fake checks from his own checkbook. One day, after yet another failure, he takes notice of some airline pilots and some stewardesses checking into a hotel. Seeing how they are given the VIP treatment everywhere they go inspires Frank. He cons his way into obtaining a Pan Am Airlines pilot's uniform and learns more about the airline by pretending to be a college student doing a report on Pan Am Airlines, and interviewing one of its top brass and former pilot. Frank then uses the uniform and knowledge to create fake checks from Pan Am, which he successfully cashes at banks and hotels all over New York. Frank tries to run the same check scam at an airport, but gets confused with an expected deadhead pilot heading to Miami. Frank rolls with it, and experiences his very first flight in Miami. By openly flirting with one of the bank tellers, Frank learns some valuable information about check routing. He then purchases a check coding machine from an auction, which he uses to further his schemes and create checks with bigger amounts. Meanwhile, Carl Hanratty has caught on to Frank's check fraud and tracks the latest falsified check to a hotel, and breaks into his room to arrest him. Frank emerges from the bathroom dressed in a suit, and knowing only that Carl is from the FBI, Frank pretends to be Agent Barry Allen of the United States Secret Service, and brazenly claims to have just caught the suspect before Carl showed up. It is not until after Frank has escaped from the room that Carl realizes he has been fooled. Following the encounter, the information in the room and Carl's description bring no clues, and fingerprints collected in the room lead nowhere. Frank purchases a Bond-style suit and an Aston Martin vehicle that he takes for a joyride. Frank soon attempts to use the money he has stolen to find a way to reunite his divorced parents. He invites his father to a fancy restaurant, and gives him the keys to a brand new Cadillac. Frank Sr. explains that he can't accept the gift, since the IRS are still watching him, and that Paula refuses to talk to him. Some months later on Christmas Eve, Carl is working in the FBI office by himself, when Frank calls to apologize for tricking him back at the hotel. Frank gives Carl his location and room number, but Carl doesn't believe him. As the conversation continues on, Carl soon realizes the reason for the call is that Frank has no one else to talk to. Frank angrily hangs up. Carl later discovers that the name Barry Allen is a character in the Flash comic books, and thinks that Frank might be a kid, which explains why they have been unsuccessful in finding any record of him or matching him through fingerprints. Their search eventually leads them to Frank's mother, who has now remarried to Jack Barnes. Upon seeing Frank's yearbook picture, Carl immediately recognizes him and finally knows who his suspect is. He then reveals to Frank's mother that Frank has already stolen about $1.3 million in check fraud. Sometime later, while visiting a friend at a hospital in Atlanta, Frank meets and takes an interest in a young hospital nurse named Brenda Strong. He decides to enroll with the hospital by pretending to be a doctor with a forged diploma from Harvard Medical School. He gets hired as the emergency room night administrator and makes sure to have Brenda on his staff. Eventually, he wins over Brenda and the two fall in love. Meanwhile, Carl visits Frank's father, who openly refuses to give up his son. However, Carl finds a letter from Frank with his address in Atlanta. The address leads Carl and his team to Frank's home, but Frank is already gone to Louisiana to meet with Brenda's parents. Frank and Brenda meet with her parents in Louisiana, where Frank not only claims to be a Lutheran like them, but also that he is a qualified lawyer, as well as a doctor. Frank passes the bar exam and joins Rogers' law firm as an assistant prosecutor. As preparations for the wedding continue, Frank travels back to New York to visit his father and tell him about the engagement. He also reveals that he got a visit from the FBI and knows what Frank is doing. Frank desperately asks his father to tell him to stop, but Frank Sr. encourages him to keep going instead. Incensed that his father is unable to act like a father, and leaved. On Christmas Eve, Frank calls Carl at the FBI office, who has been expecting the call and has his team listening in on it. Frank says he is done and settling down and is going to engage, so he asks Carl to stop chasing him. Carl informs him that this is not possible, since Frank has stolen about $4 million at this point. After looking through wedding announcements, Carl and his men manage to track Frank down on the night of the engagement party, leading Frank to confess to Brenda who he really is, before escaping out a window, and asking her to meet him at the local airport a few days later. However, when she arrives as planned, Frank is devastated to see Brenda is being watched closely by a number of disguised FBI agents which Frank hires. Frank puts a new plan into effect, where he poses as a recruiting pilot from Pan Am Airlines. He holds auditions where he picks the hottest girls he can find and goes to the airport where he walks amongst the crowd while using the girls to distract the agents from ever looking at him. Carl refuses to give up and takes one of Frank's bogus checks to professional printers who deduce, from the quality of the check, that it must have been printed on a specific kind of printer that is only available in a handful of European countries, one of which is France. Remembering from an interview with Frank's mother that she was born in France, Carl travels to her birthplace of Montréchard and finds Frank, on Christmas Eve, inside a massive printing factory, printing thousands upon thousands of checks. Carl tells Frank that he came with the French police and promised them to arrest him himself. Frank agrees to handcuff himself. Almost immediately, however, the French police arrive and escort Frank to prison, while Carl promises to have Frank extradited back to the USA. After 2 years, Frank is released into Carl's custody, as was seen in the opening of the film. As they prepare to land, Carl informs Frank that Frank Sr. died accidentally the previous year. Devastated, Frank locks himself in the plane's bathroom and escapes from the plane to track down where his mother is. Frank finds his mother, happily married to her second husband, who now has a young daughter. With his father dead and realizing his mother has moved on, Frank quietly surrenders. During the next 4 years, Frank receives regular visits from Carl, especially around Christmas time. Sometimes later Carl visits Frank again, only this time with his boss, aptly identifies as fake, as soon as he touches it. So, Carl arranges for Frank to be allowed to serve out the remainder of his sentence working for the check fraud department of the FBI under Carl's custody. Although Frank is out of prison, he is chained to his desk job and misses the thrill of his old life. When he stumbles upon a pilot uniform, Frank gets tempted into posing as an airline pilot once again. Just as he's about to fly away, Carl meets him at the airport. Carl allows him to go free, predicting that Frank will return to work on Monday since there is no one chasing him anymore. Back in the office on Monday morning, Carl is nervous when Frank doesn't show up for work on time. However, Frank